Hi, today we're going to talk about oceanic parameters. Basically, what affects the movement of ocean water. Ocean currents are affected mostly by differences in density. Basically, how much mass is in a certain volume, how concentrated, how heavy is the water. What affects the densities? Okay, let's see. Salinity affects the density of water, and temperature affects the density of water. If you have water which has no salt, we call that fresh water, it is less dense. It will float, okay? It will tend to rise, and it is less dense. It's lighter for the same amount of volume. If you have a lot of salt dissolved in the water, it will be more dense and it will tend to sink. More dense. Okay, and you can do this on your own with food coloring and salt water. If you pour the two together, the salt water will tend to go under the fresh water. If you look at differences in temperature and you put two amounts of water together, hot water on one side and cold water on the other, hot water is less dense and will tend to rise, and the cold water is more dense and will tend to go underneath, okay? So hot water tends to rise, cold water tends to sink. Hot water is less dense and cold water is more dense. Okay? So you need to understand that if you have water that's saltier, it's going to sink under the water that has less salt. Next thing you need to learn is, where do the salts that end up in our oceans, where do they come from? So if you've ever been to the ocean, you'll know that the water is very salty. You can't drink it. It'll just make you thirstier. So where is it coming from? Well, those salts are actually dissolved from minerals in rocks. Now, that can be from rivers that are running over rocks and dissolving them slowly. It can be from groundwater. There is actually water under the earth that is slowly filtering through the earth, and then it might end up in a river, which goes to the ocean. And it could be from the ocean shores and rocks touching the ocean, that they dissolve and they get hit by waves, and they contribute salts. They dissolve salts and minerals into the water. Okay? How does salinity change? Well, let's look at the three ways the concentration of salt, which is the solute, can change. Well, the first one we already talked about, right? We said if you dissolve more stuff, if you dissolve more stuff, you are dissolving stuff from the minerals and rocks on land. So that's going to increase the salinity. What happens if you add water to something that has salt dissolved in it? It's going to make it less concentrated, right? If you have your chocolate milk and you add more milk to it, your chocolate milk actually gets less chocolatey. So one source of that, actually, first of all, it's going to decrease the salinity. And where's that from? That might come from melting ice, melting glaciers, for example. And what is the last way you can change the salinity of water in the ocean? Well, it turns out that near the equator, in the warmest areas of the Earth, water is constantly evaporating from the oceans. So what ends up happening is when you're taking the water out, but you're leaving the salt there, it's going to get more concentrated. It's going to get saltier. The salinity is going to go up. So evaporation actually increases the salinity. Okay, by removing water, it's increasing the salinity. And this happens due to the sun at the equator. So I'm just going to write at equator. Okay? The last thing you need to know about what affects the temperature of water at the oceans, there's three things that affect the temperature. Depth. The deeper you go in the ocean, the colder it's going to be, which makes sense, right? The seasons, summer the water will get warmer, and in winter it'll get colder. And the latitude, basically how close are you to the equator or the North Pole? Closer to the equator, it tends to get warmer. Closer to the North Pole, it tends to get colder. Those are the three things that affect water temperature in the oceans, okay? Most of this is common sense. You just have to sort of practice it and get used to it, and just remember that, oh yeah, what's going to affect the temperature? Well, if it's closer to the North Pole, that's the latitude. Yeah, that's one thing. The seasons, that's another thing, right? The depth. Surface waters tend to be warmer than deeper waters. It all makes sense. Sometimes it's hard to remember, but if you practice it, hopefully you'll have it. So, good luck.